Alright gang, today I am reviewing The Batman, directed by Matt Reeves and starring Robert Pattinson in the title role. I want to say up front that when Robert Pattinson was cast as Bruce Wayne, I was a little skeptical. I'd really only ever known Pattinson as that dude from Twilight and maybe a few other cheesy movies, so I was understandably a little thrown off by his casting.
No, I wasn't.
Yes, you were.
But then I watched Good Time, and then I watched The Lighthouse. And that was kind of when I was like, okay, I can see this. I'm actually hyped for this now. I was all in on the Pattinson hype train. And let me tell you, the hype was warranted. This new Batman is awesome, period. Matt Reeves and his crew absolutely nailed the casting choices for this movie. And not only that, but I thought this version of Gotham is the best portrayal of the corrupt city we've ever gotten. All right, so let's just get into it. The biggest thing that I liked about this movie is Gotham itself. I feel like that's where they put the most creative emphasis on when they were thinking of how do we come at this from a fresh perspective. That groundedness and grittiness is what worked so well for Nolan's trilogy, and they definitely leaned into that side of the spectrum when it came to the setting. It's dark and rainy and just generally feels like a city that you wouldn't want to live in. I feel like more so than in any other Batman movie, this Gotham does the best job at showing how dangerous the city is outside of just having supervillains running around. Because in past movies, sure, Gotham has always been a dangerous place because these psycho supervillains are just doing crazy shit. But in this version of Gotham, it feels dangerous even without a supervillain. There's rampant crime, corrupt political figures, and for the first time, I felt like we got to see just how corrupt the police force is outside of Gordon. Which brings me to the next biggest thing that I liked about the movie, and that's Jeffrey Wright as Gordon. Just wow. This is by far my favorite Gordon we've ever gotten. He's funny, he's charming, and for the first time, I felt like we got to truly see just how overmatched Gordon is and how much the odds are against him in this city, simply from the fact that he's a good cop. And I think that's another thing that separates this Gotham from other movies' Gothams. Batman and Gordon are not only up against crime and crazy supervillains, but they're also up against it from an institutional standpoint. They can't just turn to anyone within the police force. Gordon is essentially on his own. But it also shows just how valuable Gordon is to Batman, because he knows he's got that one guy, that one good cop he can trust. I just loved their relationship in this movie, and I loved how important Gordon was in this movie. Alright, and speaking of things they're up against, let's talk about the Riddler. Holy freaking performance, Batman. Paul Dano is just the king of these weird, creepy performances. He's so good at coming off as like this meek, seemingly harmless dude who can just go off the rails at any moment. And I just really like how the Riddler fit into this kind of Batman movie. He's really grounded, he feels really modern, and probably the most disturbing part about the Riddler is that nothing he does is fantastical. Nothing he does is campy or comic booky, I should say. In fact, it's quite the opposite. A lot of the things the Riddler does is things we've seen in real life. Matt Reeves and his crew clearly drew inspiration from real-life serial killers. And that's kind of what makes this Riddler even scarier than any other villain we've seen in a lot of ways. When you realize a lot of the stuff the Riddler does in the movie has actually been done in real life, it can make the movie feel a little bit unsettling. But it all just totally fits within this dark and gritty interpretation of Batman. It's definitely Frank Miller's Batman through and through, and it totally works. Alright, now let's talk about Batman himself. I feel like one thing we've never really had in past Batman movies is a truly interesting Bruce Wayne. I feel like in most other Batman films, Batman isn't really the most interesting character. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that Batman has arguably the best rogues gallery of any superhero in comic book lore, but that doesn't take away from the fact that in almost all of his movies, Batman is usually not the most interesting character in his own movie. In this version, however, Batman was by far the most interesting character. And that's not to take anything away from Paul Dano as the Riddler. Like I said before, I loved him in this. But I feel like we get the most characterization out of this Batman than we've ever gotten before. He's definitely interesting in ways that he wasn't before. He's obviously a badass and he's heroic and all that in this too, but you almost pity this Bruce Wayne more than anything. This is a wounded Bruce Wayne, a troubled Batman who has doubts about what he's doing and whether it's working or if it's even worth it in the end. And Robert Pattinson is just perfect as this kind of Batman. He is an emo Batman. He's a grunge Batman. He broods and says things like,
"I'm vengeance."
But it works. It just totally works. I can't say enough about his performance in this. I officially no longer see him as just the Twilight dude.
No, I wasn't.
Yes, you were.
All right, so with all that said, is this movie at the end of the day better than The Dark Knight? No, it's not. I did think the movie was a little long, and I did feel like it lost some steam towards the end. The first half of the movie was just paced so well. It really took its time to establish Gotham and establish who Batman is as an interesting character. But once the latter half came, I felt like they were rushing a bit to squeeze in all the twists and turns and big revelations and whatnot. So in other words, it was a long movie, but it never felt like it dragged. It more so felt like they were just trying to squeeze in a little too much story towards the end, and it did suffer because of that. And I also just didn't think the climax was as good as the build-up toward it. So because of that, didn't quite stick the landing in the same ways that Nolan did with his Dark Knight trilogy. However, I do think this Batman sits comfortably in my top 3 of all-time Batman movies. It has probably my favorite Gotham, my favorite Gordon by far, and it has by far my favorite interpretations of Penguin and Riddler. No offense to Jim Carrey, of course.
Please! You're as blind as a bat!
So yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll do a ranking video, list out my favorite Batmans. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you want something like that. So, onto my rating. Here at Nerdy Ernie, we do a bit of a different rating system. In lieu of a traditional 1 to 5 star or 1 to 10 star rating, we do a 1 to 6 beer rating system. The more beers it takes to enjoy the movie, the worse the movie is. The less beers, the better the movie. I'm giving the Batman 2 beers. And honestly, you don't even need a beer for the first hour of the movie. I thought the first half of this movie was probably some of the best Batman content we've ever gotten. Save those 2 beers for the back half, and you will love this movie. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you next time.